Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I will analyze the controversy surrounding the SIG Sauer P320 semi-automatic pistol. First, I'll look at the background of this case, including the timeline of the incidents, then offer my analysis. SIG Sauer is a firearm manufacturer that was established in 1976, although its origin story dates back to 1853. There are three branches of the company that use the SIG Sauer name, one in Germany, one in Switzerland, and one in the United States. When I refer to SIG Sauer, I am talking about the U.S. one, which is based in Newington, New Hampshire. In 2014, SIG Sauer started selling a modular striker-fired pistol called the P320. This weapon uses a frame from the P250, which is a hammer-fired pistol. The P320 uses a partially pre-tensioned striker, which means it's almost like a single-action pistol. 5 different calibers are available for the P320, 9mm Parabellum, 357 SIG, 40 S&W, 45 ACP, and 10mm Auto. It is a very popular weapon. About 3 million have been sold. Versions of the P320 are widely used in the military, where they are designated M17 and M18. The M17 is the full size, and the M18 is compact. When the pistol first came out, it had a problem where it could discharge if it was dropped in a certain way. The heavy weight of the trigger meant that the inertia would cause it to depress when the gun hit the ground, and the weapon would discharge. SIG Sauer initiated a voluntary upgrade program where they lightened the trigger, the sear, and the striker, as well as installing a mechanical disconnector. This upgrade resolved the problem, but some people continue to believe the pistol was defective and claimed it had a different problem. Namely, it would fire without the trigger being depressed. Over the years, over 100 people made this complaint. Many of them were injured as a result of an unintentional discharge. Some of the pistols involved in these incidents were the ones that had the 2017 upgrade. Several lawsuits were filed against SIG Sauer by people claiming the weapon was defective and unsafe. SIG Sauer prevailed in some of the lawsuits and others were settled. Throughout these lawsuits, testing never revealed a defect with the weapon. The P320 only discharged when the trigger was pulled. In March 2025, a lawsuit was filed on behalf of 22 plaintiffs from 16 states. The plaintiffs claimed the P320 had a defect that caused uncommanded firing. That is, the weapon would discharge without the trigger being pulled. Here are a few examples of the incidents from this lawsuit. In May 2023, a police department issued P320 discharged when an officer holstered the weapon. An officer standing nearby was struck in his right leg. In June 2023, a P320 unexpectedly discharged when being unholstered by an officer. The bullet struck the officer in his hip. In August 2023, a man holstered a P320. It discharged, and he was struck in his foot. In July 2024, an officer was struck in the knee after a P320 discharged during holstering. In October and August of 2024, the same thing happened to 2 other officers. When looking through all the incidents, all the discharges occurred when someone was either holstering or unholstering a P320. In the vast majority of the incidents, the lawsuit said that the individual involved in the unintentional discharge did not place their finger squarely on the trigger within the trigger guard. The use of the word squarely is curious. It sounds as though their finger may have been touching the trigger. In July 2025, a 21-year-old airman stationed at Warren Air Force Base in Cheyenne, Wyoming, was killed by an M18 pistol. The Air Force has not revealed any information about the circumstances of the shooting, but of course, some people have wondered if this could have been an uncommanded discharge. In response to the fatality, Air Force Global Strike Command ordered an indefinite pause on the use of the P320. This incident has renewed public interest in the weapon and has caused a lot of discussion and speculation. On its website, SIG Sauer indicated that the P320 meets and exceeds all industry safety standards. The company addressed many of the claims which have been made about the weapon. In response to the claim that the P320 can discharge without a trigger pull, SIG Sauer stated, quote, "The P320 cannot, under any circumstances, discharge without a trigger pull. This is verified through extensive testing by SIG Sauer, the U.S. military, elite law enforcement agencies, and independent laboratories," unquote. To explain the seemingly large number of unintended discharge incidents, SIG Sauer indicated that all the verified incidents have been attributed to improper handling, incompatible equipment, trigger access vulnerability, or a lapse in firearm safety, not to any defect in the P320. Now moving to my analysis. Here are my thoughts on a few areas that stood out to me in this case. Item number 1. There's a lot of controversy about the P320, and it has been discussed quite a bit. But these discussions often lack an explanation of how the fire control unit actually works in the weapon. SIG Sauer has a video on their website that explains the mechanics of the fire control unit. I will use parts of this video to illustrate how the P320 fires. The sequence starts when the trigger, shown in red, is pressed to the rear. This moves the trigger bar, shown in blue, forward. The captive safety lever, shown in red, rotates upward. The striker safety lock, shown in green, rotates upward. The sear, also shown in green, rotates downward. The striker pin, shown in red, is released, which discharges the weapon by striking the primer of a chambered cartridge. When looking at how this weapon discharges, it's clear that the design of the P320 is not really that unusual. It does not wander into some experimental area of mechanical engineering. From a scientific point of view, there is no reason the weapon should fire without the trigger being pulled. No expert, including those for the plaintiffs in lawsuits filed against SIG Sauer, has demonstrated a malfunction where the weapon fires without trigger movement. There have been many complaints using general language like defective design, manufacturing defect, and failure of internal safeties, but no one has actually proven what the problem is specifically. If the weapon really had a defect, why haven't the plaintiffs clearly identified it? Why don't they say something like, it's the trigger bar, or it's the sear, and here's how it works. We can prove how those components are failing. Instead of just saying, well, it's defective. Okay, that's great, but how is it defective? What is actually wrong with it, and can that be proven? It seems strange that nobody can clearly state the problem. Maybe there is no problem. Perhaps the unintentional discharges were caused by negligence on the part of the person handling the P320. Item number 2. There's a very popular video about the P320 on YouTube on a channel called Wyoming Gun Project, where a content creator causes a P320 to discharge without fully depressing the trigger. In the video, the content creator loads a case with a primer into the chamber of a P320, so no propellant and no bullet. He then depresses the trigger almost to the break by placing a screw up into the frame right in front of the trigger. After this, he pushes down the slide and the weapon discharges. He replicates this several times. Many people have watched this video and are now convinced that the P320 is defective. How is it possible that the weapon is discharging without the trigger being fully pulled? Doesn't that mean that something's wrong with the weapon? There is no doubt that this video doesn't look good for the P320. I can understand why people would look at it and say, well, that's it. This proves the weapon is defective. This is the elusive evidence that all of these plaintiffs were trying to find. Even so, this experiment has several threats to its validity. Only one weapon is being tested. Is this weapon defective? Was it modified in a way unknown to the operator? Has it been damaged? No other semi-automatic pistols are tested in the same video. Can this discharge be replicated with guns that are not P320s? The P320 was not designed to be used with a screw stuck in the frame. How is this screw affecting the internal components, like the trigger bar? When the slide is being pushed down and shaken, is it making contact with the screw and pushing it into another component? When looking at the lawsuits that have been filed against SIG Sauer, no one is complaining about a discharge after pulling the trigger to any degree and pushing down on the slide. That is not the problem the gun supposedly has. Many of the plaintiffs have claimed the gun discharged when being placed in or pulled out of a holster. That, of course, could put pressure on the slide, but that has nothing to do with the trigger. I think what could be happening in the Wyoming Gun Project video is the trigger is being taken right up to the point of the break. When the slide is moved, the pressure is causing the sear to release the striker. The internal safeties have been disabled, so that's all it takes for a discharge. That is not ideal, but it is not the smoking gun that people are looking for. It does not explain the unintentional discharges that have been the subject of litigation. Item number 3, do I believe that the SIG Sauer P320 has a defect which causes it to fire without the trigger being pulled? In my opinion, no. The science is actually pretty clear in this case. There is agreement between experts on both sides, plaintiff and defendant. The P320 does not fire without the trigger being pulled. Now, could an individual pistol have a defect, like something became damaged internally, maybe the gun was mistreated, perhaps it was modified? Certainly that's a possibility, but there is no systemic problem of which I am aware. If my assessment is correct, then what's causing all these unintentional discharges and lawsuits? This is just a theory, my opinion. The SIG Sauer P320 is a very popular weapon. It is used by a lot of police departments. Many of the unintentional discharges involve police officers who may not have sufficient training. I think these discharges were actually negligent discharges. There are a variety of ways this can happen. A few examples: keeping one's finger on the trigger and unintentionally pulling the trigger when holstering or unholstering. Before a weapon is holstered, a foreign object falls into the holster, like a set of keys. The person feels the resistance as the foreign object depresses the trigger, but they continue to push down, something they should never do, and this discharges the weapon. Using a holster which is not designed for the P320, a piece of that holster intrudes into the trigger guard and depresses the trigger. Sometimes people may have simply been playing around with the pistol irresponsibly, like pretending to shoot something. They had their finger on the trigger and unintentionally pulled it. When these negligent discharges started occurring, people remembered that the older P320s had that problem where dropping them could lead to a discharge. This led them to think that their own unintentional discharge occurred because something was wrong with the gun. Lawsuits were then filed. As other people had negligent discharges, they too decided to blame the P320. Everybody was piling on. There's a lot of shame in having a negligent discharge, especially among people who appreciate firearms. This gave people a way to escape the shame. They could say, "It wasn't my fault. Something was wrong with the gun." Years ago, the same thing happened with Toyota. There was a problem where floor mats were pushing accelerators down, causing unintended acceleration. The problem was fixed, but people started to say that there must be more defects, like the computer has gone haywire and is commanding the vehicle to take off out of nowhere. In reality, there was no problem with the computer. Another factor contributing to the situation with SIG Sauer is how, lately, the public really seems to distrust experts. This was highlighted during the COVID pandemic. In the case of SIG Sauer, experts who studied mechanical engineering and designed gun components have repeatedly stated there's nothing wrong with the P320, yet they are being dismissed, and in some cases, accused of being involved in a massive cover-up. Is it possible that SIG Sauer is trying to hide an unknown defect? I guess anything is possible, but again, why haven't the experts for the plaintiffs identified and proven the problem? Is the P320 really that mysterious? Are its inner workings unknowable? It does not use a magical design. The operation of the pistol is governed by physics. The science behind striker-fired pistols has been around for quite some time. One would think that if there was a problem causing the weapon to discharge without the trigger being pulled, it would have been identified a long time ago. Now moving to my final thoughts. Even though I believe the SIG Sauer P320 cannot fire without the trigger being pulled, I can understand why people would not want to own one. It just seems like an unnecessary risk. Why select a pistol with this poor reputation when there are many others that seem a lot safer? I think it's up to each person to conduct their own research and decide for themselves. The case of the SIG Sauer P320 serves as a reminder that it's important for anyone handling firearms to be properly trained. Negligent discharges are a massive problem, which kill and injure many people every year. All types of firearms are represented in these incidents. The safety rules for handling firearms should always be followed. There can never be any exceptions. Unfortunately, this is not the lesson that will be learned from this case. Rather, many people will believe that the P320 can fire without the trigger being pulled. Confidence in the weapon has now been lost, and I'm not sure that SIG Sauer can do anything about it. Once the pile-on starts, it's very difficult to stop. no number of safeties can prevent the discharge, so to speak. Even so, I would hope that the good that can come from this case is that more people will pay attention to the risk of negligent discharges, regardless of what weapon they're using. Ironically, a weapon with a bad reputation may actually lead to safer gun handling practices. Those are my thoughts on the controversy surrounding the SIG Sauer P320. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. When looking at all the comments that have been made on this P320 controversy, one thing that stands out to me, which is kind of familiar, is how there's a divide between people who have familiarity with the topic and those who don't. Like for those who are not familiar with firearms, overwhelmingly, they tend to believe that something is wrong with the P320. They believe it can discharge without the trigger being pulled. For those who are familiar with weapons, they are much less likely to believe this, at least based on my observations in reading a few hundred comments. I think it's interesting that this type of divide frequently occurs. It's really about how comfortable someone feels with a certain topic. Back in the days of the COVID pandemic, people who were familiar with the research on vaccines felt pretty comfortable with the various COVID-19 vaccines. People who were not as familiar with the research tended to be more frightened about what the vaccines could cause. They were worried that the vaccines would not be effective. If someone looks around, they can find examples from all types of areas, not just firearms or vaccines, but for anything, for any discipline, any field where there are people who have familiarity with it and people who don't, and they form very different opinions about the safety or effectiveness related to that field. So I think a lot of this problem with the SIG Sauer is really about understanding how the firearm actually functions. If somebody's not really familiar with how firearms work, then terms like striker, sear, or trigger bar will seem foreign and maybe even frightening. Like, what are those components? What do they do? How do I know if they're functioning well together or not? So it just becomes this mystery, like whatever is inside that weapon, whatever's inside the P320 is unknowable. It's behind the slide, it's behind the frame. There's no way to know what's going on. And even when people view cutaway views of the weapon, they still don't really understand how those parts interact, how they lead to a discharge. I think what it comes down to is that in a society, people have to trust experts at some point. They might sidestep that for a certain topic, like the P320, but in other areas, they're not going to have a choice. There's no way to be an expert in everything, or even to have a good understanding of everything. So there will always be areas where people simply have to have trust. It's how society is configured. It's an inescapable reality with living in a culture with millions or hundreds of millions of people. There needs to be some level of cooperation and trust. When that erodes for any specific topic, like the SIG Sauer P320, this is what we see. We see a lot of distrust. We see a lot of people saying, well, I may or may not understand the engineering, but I somehow know the weapon is firing without the trigger being pulled. And then they'll look at an example where the trigger is being partially pulled and the slide is being manipulated and say, well, that's proof that it can fire without the trigger being pulled, which really doesn't make any sense. That's not how that works. If somebody's partially pulling the trigger, then that's a different set of circumstances. Again, the lawsuits involving SIG Sauer do not involve anyone claiming that they partially pulled the trigger and manipulated the slide. That's not what those lawsuits were about. Now, maybe there's some new problem that people want to claim, and that's fine, but it has nothing to do with those lawsuits. So the next question becomes, what can be done about this? What can be done about the divide of opinions between people who are familiar with a topic and people who are not? I think it really just comes down to building trust, trying to be transparent, and trying to offer educational materials that can illustrate how the dynamics of a topic work, like to explain the inner workings of a P320. I think some people will have their doubts. They'll look at the videos where there are maybe negligent discharges framed as defect-based discharges, and they'll say, well, that proves that something's going on. But then when they dig more into it and they look at the educational materials, they'll realize, well, maybe something else is happening. Maybe there's not some type of systemic defect after all. So I think it just comes down to people need to be flexible and open to learning. If they really want to know the truth behind something like this, they have to conduct their own research, and they have to know how to conduct research. They have to be aware of experimental design to some extent. What are the threats to validity? If somebody doesn't know that, how can they put together an experiment? So it becomes difficult. There is no easy answer. But again, flexibility in thinking, being open to learning more about the topic, I think those things can help. In the end, when these types of situations balloon out of control, as I mentioned, they're very difficult to stop. I think the reputation of the P320 has been permanently damaged. In my opinion, there's no clear way on a wide scale that it can be restored.